Well, if you follow the basic sentence structure through this passage, it's actually pretty simple. We tried to see you. We couldn't do it. We sent Tim. He says you're good. We're happy about that. That was that whole passage, 5 sentences. And yet there were 17 verses. There we are. Why is that? Well, some of you might say, Ben, that's just the Bible being weird. That's how it always is. It's a strange book. And yet, let me say this, before we dismiss it as being unnecessarily verbose, you have to understand what's happening in this passage and why it matters. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the Thessalonians. Now, the Apostle Paul, by honestly any metric, was one of the most influential human beings who ever walked on this globe. That much of the New Testament was penned by Paul, and his writings has shaped human culture, government, society in ways that few other human beings ever have. He is demonstrably one of the most influential human beings in history who's ever walked on this planet, the Apostle Paul. And even in his day, they understood that this was a man of significance. It's interesting, when he preached for the first time in Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, his detractors, his enemies, said this about him in Acts 17:6. It says, when they could not find them, the mob looking for Paul and his team, it says they dragged out Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." That these people who didn't believe in what Paul was selling said, but we know this man is turning the world upside down, that when he and his team arrive in a culture, they don't shift to the culture changes. That as they've moved from the Middle East to the Mediterranean on into Rome, the world is changing because of these people. Paul was a world-changing leader, something that many of us aspire to be in our lives. And so it's fascinating as we look at this, you go, Paul was changing the world. The Thessalonians were influential in their days as well. This was the metropolis, the main city of their province, and it stood at the axis of the major trade routes of the Roman Empire. This is an influential man speaking to influential people, and what these guys did changed the world as we know it. So the question arises, I think, for some of us, how do you become a person like that? Many of us are here in the city because you want to make a difference. You want to be someone of consequence with your life. How do you be a culture-shaping person? Well, one of the first things you realize is you don't do it alone. You can't. You need to be a part of a community that's bigger than you and a cause that's bigger than you. And Paul rolled with a team. But once you understand that, you go, there's all kinds of teams, all kinds of communities, groups of friends that get together and do stuff, and they don't change the world. And yet you look at Paul and you go, this was a culture-changing community. How do you do that? How do you be the kind of person that you say, that team changed the whole industry? That group of friends changed Washington. That community of girls changed this neighborhood. That church changed a city. How do you become those kinds of people? Well, that's the opportunity we have now, because what we have right here is we have the personal correspondence of one of the most influential peoples in history to some of the most influential people in history. This is the behind-the-scenes documentary of a dynasty. This is a camera in the locker room for the pregame speech from the coach. This is the last dance, the 30 for 30 on one of the most influential teams ever. And so what I love about this passage is we're going to see, how does a winning team like that talk to each other? What do they prioritize? And we're not just going to hear what they said, but how they said it and why they said it. We're going to see 3 essential characteristics of a culture-changing community. And my hope is not that we'd see them, but that we would become like them. So starting in verse 17, it says this: "But since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face." Now, the simple sentence there is, we endeavored to see you. And yet here right away, you see Paul takes that simple sentence and he just packs all around it, clauses and phrases and modifiers, jammed all around it. But in doing so, he's creating an emotional environment that's worth looking at. He says, since we were torn away from you. And so if you remember, Paul preached in Thessalonica and persecution broke out. They couldn't find Paul and his team, so they grabbed some of the locals and started roughing them up. And Paul realized, my presence is creating a risk for this community. So for their safety, he left. But he doesn't say that. He says, you know, we were ripped away from you. And he uses this emotionally charged term of a parent losing a child or a child being orphaned. He says, you know, we were torn away from you. Brothers, he calls them family. And then he says, and person not in heart. We were torn away from you physically, but my heart stayed with you, right? And he says, and then we endeavored all the more eagerly with great desire to see you. He didn't just say we tried to come see you. He said we endeavored with eagerness. And then he says with great desire. There's a word desire, thumia, like heat, like I long for something, I desire it. And then he added the epi on top of it. That means not just desire, but epithumia on top of desire. Desire stacked on desire, a layer cake of desire. That's what I was experiencing as I long not just to see you, but to see your face near my face. And so he's just dramatically piling up these words. I endeavored all the more eagerly to see you face to face. Why? Verse 18, because we wanted to come to you. I endeavored to see you right because I wanted to be with you. I, Paul, just in case you forgot who was writing this, me, this guy, again and again. But no less than Satan himself hindered us. Now, why this complete pileup of language? I think what Paul was feeling is because he had to leave more abruptly than he wanted to, he was worried this little fledgling community would wonder, does Paul care? Does he think of us? And so Paul writes to them and he ransacks language to let them know, I want to be with you. You are my family. I was ripped away from you and didn't like it, and I did everything in my power to get back, and I haven't been successful yet. But then he tells them the reason why all this language of longing in verse 19. He says, for what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? Is it not you? That for there is the reason. He says the reason for all this desire. And then he points to the arrival of Jesus Christ when he stops history. And Paul says, why do I long to see you so much? Because when the world ends and history stops, the best thing in my life is you. You are my glory. You are my joy. When the world is over and I face my maker and I add up my life, the best thing I have, the thing that makes me smile and the thing I'm proud of, the thing I have joy in and the best thing I got is you. What matters in the end is you. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever written a letter like that to anyone? To anyone you weren't trying to hook up with sexually? This is not a romantic letter. He isn't writing it to a girlfriend. He's writing it to a community, and he can bear his heart like that. Let me ask you this. Have you ever received a letter like that? Has anyone ever said that to you? I long for you. You're my family. I love you. I am eagerly endeavoring to see your face because you are the best I got. Anyone ever talk to you for that? Some of you, you've spent so much time in counseling because the deepest pain in your life is that your parents never spoke like this to you. Do you have a community now of people you could write like this to and it not come off as super weird? Before you dismiss it. This is how a culture-changing community talks to each other. So what's the first characteristic? Paul is wholehearted in his devotion to these people. He's not halfway. He's not playing it safe. He's not saying, y'all seem cool. He's saying, I am all in on you. He has an unbounded affection for these people. He has compassion, co-passion. That there's some people you keep a safe emotional distance from. There's some people you don't go on every journey of their emotions, but yet there's a small group of community that in the best of your life, you say, but with these people, if they hurt, I hurt. If they rejoice, I rejoice. If they win, I'm winning. If they're losing, I'm losing. There's some people where you go, there's no distance between us. And Paul looks at the Thessalonians and says, you're that for me. I have co-passion with you. I hurt when you hurt. I celebrate when you celebrate. I am not withholding my heart from you. I am risking all of me for you. Paul was wholehearted in his genuine affection for these people. And the best cultures are like that. The best I have in life is you. My joy is bound up in you. And then he says later in the book, now I live because I know you're good. Was that overly dramatic? No. He says, my life is bound up with you. And let me say this. We know the best are like this. Like if I were to ask you, who's the best teacher you ever had? My guess is You wouldn't maybe even say the most educated professor you ever had, the one with the most degrees. It may not be. But if I asked you, who was the best teacher you ever had? Who's the one that comes to mind? The one that you knew cared about the subject, but more than that, cared about you knowing it, cared about you learning, cared about you incorporating this knowledge to be a better person and reach your potential. Your favorite teacher was the one you go, that person cared about investing in me. They didn't hold it back and play it safe. They were completely wholeheartedly invested in me as a student, right? The best coaches are that way. I remember when I led a ministry on the campus of Texas A&M, that we would use the basketball arena, and the basketball coach at the time for our team would cry in post-game interviews talking about these young men. And he challenged them. Their practices were tough. He expected excellence. And yet when he talked about them emotionally, it was easy for him to weep because of how much he loved these boys. I would use the tunnels downstairs in the arena where we'd do the Bible study, and all through it were these banners they had put up, not for the crowds to see, just for them. And the banners just had one word on it: family. Family. And you could see they felt that about each other. They believed, these are my people. I'm theirs and they're mine. That's the best kind of team. That's the best kind of friends. That's the best kind of minister. John Perkins, who's a huge influence on me, said, you want to minister to a community, you move among them, and their hurts are your hurts, and their joys are your joys. I remember for me, when I first really started ministry, I was a college student, and I became chaplain of this men's organization. And as a chaplain, you had to speak to them once every meeting. And it was the first time for me I was ever had to sit there and go like, what can I say to some people to try to help them improve in their lives? And the weirdest things started to happen. I started to think about their lives and think about where they were struggling, what was tripping them up, what temptations and shame were getting to them. And I'd find myself just praying for them. And I'd find myself getting emotional about it. Like if they were hurting, I was hurting. If they did something right or won, I felt like I won. And it was the weirdest thing. I'm like, what is going on with me? I care. And I remember at the end of my college career, so much of what I had chased had gone away. It didn't matter. Your friendship groups move on. But when I looked at the best of my life at the end of college, I was like, it was these men that I invested in. That was the best I had, was you. Here's one of the things that bothers me about a lot of Western Christianity, that if I asked you, what's the goal of Christianity or spirituality? You would say, be a good person, be moral, don't get drunk as much. And it's so individualistic. But that's not what Paul says. Paul says, when I picture the end of my life and the end of days, my goal is not to be a good dude. He said, my goal is to leverage my life for you. That what matters in the end is I poured my life into some people, that I committed myself to a community, that I did not hold myself back, but I risked loving you. Paul was wholehearted. And that's the kind of team that changes a culture. Now, is there risk to that? Yes, you could get hurt. And Paul had Demas who betrayed him. Yes, when you risk giving your heart away emotionally, you could get hurt. But if you don't give it away, I would say you risk much more. You know, we've all heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. I want to be where the people are. I read this deal recently that was talking about FOBO, the fear of better options. That's why a lot of people don't commit to relationships, to plans, to Friday night. Do you want to come? We'll see. And you're just waiting like, anybody else, anybody else, anybody else? And you're just kind of waiting. And look, you can do that dating. Hey, make some good choices. But in your life, if you always keep yourself away from a small group, a Bible study, a church, a community like that, and you go, well, I'm just going to see, well, I don't know, there might be a better option. At some point, you're just alone. And the clock never stops running. And if you just keep waiting for perfection, you're going to wait out the opportunity to have significance. And Paul says, no, I'm all in on these Thessalonians. I'm all in on them. For better, for worse, I'm here. You know, I heard, like many of you, for years, motivational speakers, use that illustration like, what do you want on your tombstone? And I could just never get into it. I'm like, I don't know, man. Like my name, like I don't really care. And they were like, well, what do you want people to say at your funeral? I'm like, that it's over? And then go have some cake. Like, I don't care, man. But then I remember I was reading this book once and it said like, imagine a hospital room. And I could do that because I'd been to a lot of hospital rooms, visiting people who were very sick. Or I'd been the person in the bed before. And he said, imagine being in that bed in the hospital room and imagine the doctor coming in and saying, I'm sorry, you got maybe a year. And he got me with that one. And he said, now in that moment, what in your life that's so important right now suddenly doesn't matter at all. And what suddenly becomes very important. And I remember at that time, I was teaching a Bible study of young men. I still do it, teach our team leaders. And I remember looking at that group of men and telling them, I would keep doing this. I wouldn't cancel this. That I'm investing the best of all words into some people I can influence for good. I would keep this meeting. I would preach this book to the people God's put me in front of as much as I can, and I would clear out and cancel a lot of stuff to spend the maximum amount of time with some friends and family and the people I was mentoring. Because what matters at the end is not the stuff, what matters is you. So what do you think about at the end? An accumulation of money, an accumulation of power, an accumulation of morality? Paul says when the clouds rend and Jesus returns, the people who will be smiling will be the young women that have a group of junior high girls behind him. They go, yeah, I got a job. Yeah, I made money. Yeah, I did that. But I didn't forget about the ones behind me as they went through some awkward challenges in life. I invested in the next generation. It's some older people that said, I'm going to mentor with the life and breath God gives me to invest in others. Paul said, what's my glory and joy in the end? It's you. What's the first characteristic of a culture-changing community? They're wholehearted. I do not keep myself separate from you. Mark DeMoss was asked one time, how do you finish well? And he said, you live well till you're finished. You don't know when your end is, so get ready now. So whatever values you want to be true of you in the end, do them now. And if you protect your heart, yeah, you'll keep it safe, but your heart will shrink, and so will your life and your influence. Paul was wholehearted. He gave himself away to the people he loved. But notice something else as we go on, chapter 3, verse 1. He says, therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, which doesn't sound like a great sacrifice. I loved you so much, I was willing to be by myself. And you go, Ben, that's like the goal of many introverts. That doesn't sound like a real sacrifice, but you got to remember who's talking. This is the Apostle Paul, that every town he preached in, there were people trying to kill him, okay? So being alone could have been very detrimental to his health. The man was more controversial than Kanye, and yet he's looking at this crowd of people and going, you know what? I'm going to risk rolling solo, no crew, so I can deploy Tim to check on you. I'm not worried about you. So he sends Tim to them. In verse 2, it says, we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker, which is a pretty epic title in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith. Establish means to get you steady, like you're a little wobbly. He's like, I sent Timothy to stabilize you, and then to exhort you is to call you forward. So I sent Timothy to stabilize you and send you forward, right? That was his goal. Verse 3, so that no one be moved by these afflictions, because pain was coming, and I didn't want you to get agitated and decleated. I didn't want you to get destabilized by a little bit of pain. It's interesting, he'll say in the rest of the verse, he says, for you yourselves know that we are destined for this. He'll say later in the book, we've been destined for salvation, and he says here, we're destined for suffering, that's the Christian life. That God destines us for salvation and for suffering. The Christian life is not always a safe life. God didn't promise you that, but he does promise a significant life for those who follow him. And he says, I didn't want you to be moved by these afflictions because you know we were destined for this. Well, how did they know that? Verse 4, for when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand. Oh, that's how they knew. He's like, hey guys, suffering is coming. We were to suffer affliction, and just as it's come to pass, and just as you know. He's like, and I told you so. But verse 5, for this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you and our labor would be in vain. So he said, I sent Timothy to stabilize you and to send you forward because I realized that a little bit of affliction would make you maybe turn loose of this and God wasn't worth it, destabilize, punt the mission. He said, I was worried you'd get tempted to lay it up, play safe, take it easy, and I didn't want you to do that. I wanted your foot on the gas. I wanted you to keep moving. And so I sent Timothy to check on you, make sure you're okay, challenge you. And then he says in verse 6, but now Timothy's come to us from you, and he's brought us the good news of your faith and love and reported that you always remember us kindly as we long to see you. Did I mention that? As we long to see you. For this reason, brothers, in all our distress and afflictions, we've been comforted about you through your faith. For now we live if you are standing fast in the Lord. For what thanksgiving can we return to God for you, for all the joy that we feel for your sake before our God, as we pray most earnestly night and day, that we may see you face to face to supply what is lacking in your faith. That all sounds so encouraging until that last part. I just can't wait to see you again to supply what is lacking in your faith. How would you like to get that letter? Man, I can't wait to come over and address your deficiencies. Dude, I'm so looking forward to lunch on Monday where we're gonna discuss some of your shortcomings, okay? You get amped about that? And yet notice in this, that's what Paul does. He loves them, he's wholehearted, he cares deeply about them, but that doesn't keep him from challenging them to be more than they are. I want to stabilize you and send you forward and challenge you that you would stand fast, that Paul loves them, but he's not intimidated by them. He's emotionally invested, but he's not emotionally needy. Because if he was needy, he wouldn't challenge him. And yet you hear Paul not only has compassion, but he's willing to challenge them. Paul's wholehearted, but he's level-headed. Or I love the way Tim Keller said it, who studied this passage, helped mine so much. He said he gave his heart, but he kept his head. That Paul had compassion, but it didn't keep him from correction. Wholehearted devotion, but an action orientation. I love you right where you are, but I'm calling you to more. And I see you and care about you, but I see some lack too, and I'm gonna bring it up to make you better. Good friends do that. If you've got a group of friends that you never challenge, you never call them to more, you never supply what is lacking in their faith, you might need to question what's the end goal for you. Is it to really love that person, or is it to just try to make sure they like you, right? True love wants the truth for people, right? So I remember running into people all the time that they would have a friendship group that they wanted to influence for Jesus, but they were too scared to ever confront him. So they'd be out at the bar and their friends are getting hammered and you'd be like, you should drink less. What? No, nothing. Jesus, what? Nothing. And you're like, bro, you are having zero impact on these people because you're worried about offending them. But assess that for a minute. What are you worried about? You're not necessarily worried about hurting them. You think what you would share with them would help them. What you're afraid of is that they won't like you anymore. So what you care about is not them, you care about you. And so you will withhold information from them in order for them to continue to give affection for you. You're not a real friend. You just care about you. But Paul's wholehearted. I love you guys. But he's level-headed, and you got some problems. And I'm about to enumerate them. You may want to write these down, right? That's a good friend. That's a good coach. You don't want a coach that just tells you, you're awesome, you're the best, yay. You want a coach that's going to say, hey, but let me make you better. Some of you are leaders and CEOs and organizations, and you know the higher you get them in the organization, the harder it is to find people who will be honest with you. I think these people are telling me what they think I want to hear, but someone needs to help me get better because I know I'm not good enough. And you start scanning the crowd for someone who loves you but isn't impressed by you. And that's what I tell people all the time. That's the kind of friend you want. Someone who loves you but is not impressed by you, is loving enough to be honest with you, that they have compassion, but they also have correction. They're gonna bring to you an action orientation. You need to change. I remember for me, when I was in my 20s, I went through a real crisis of faith. Like, is all this real? Do I really believe this? And in the midst of that, I just had a powerful sort of encounter with learning more about God and trusting him more. And I had almost a rebirth of like, I do believe this. I do believe Jesus is who he says he is. I do believe he did what he said he'd do. And God did some massive renovating in my heart. And I just felt like a new Christian again in my 20s, just so excited about really loving God and really knowing him. And one of the first things I did was I was invited to go on a mission trip for a whole summer and live in a church and minister among these other believers. And I remember as I did that, I made friends with all the people on this trip. There was one guy that was a really good buddy, Ben, and we would hang out together, we'd take walks together, we'd go running together. And I'll never forget, Ben, we were on a walk one day and he was like, hey man, I just want you to know, I'm really enjoying getting to know you. Like, I just love you, man, I truly do. I was like, oh, thanks, bud. He was like, yeah, here's the deal. He said, you can talk however you want with me. He said, but the volume of profanity you use is a bit confusing to the other people on this mission trip. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, look, talk however you want with me. I'm just saying the cussing minister is confusing to some of the people. You may want to dial it down a shade. And I remember being so surprised. I was like, what? Like, what, can you use some examples? Like, I didn't know what he was talking about. But as he said it, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. Oh, no, I can see that. And then as he's explaining it to me, I'm like, oh, man, like, how long has this been going on? How many people were aware of this? I was making things awkward. I was looking weird and no one told me? How come none of y'all were fine with me being that guy? And then I realized Ben's a true friend because he was willing to risk awkwardness. He was risking me to get mad at him to make me better. And guess what? I changed. And our ministry had a lot less profanity and was maybe more beneficial to the people, right? Because we had a culture that says, I love you right where you are and love you too much to let you stay there. So I have compassion for you, but I'm gonna challenge you, right? I've got a devotion and an action orientation, and that's what you need. I listened to an interview the other day with Brad Cooper, the actor, and he was talking to Will Arnett and a couple of guys in this interview, and he was talking about as his star was rising and his career taking off, he started to feel all this pressure, like I gotta be the funny guy, and back then he thought being funny was like ripping on people, and so he was at this dinner party and he was trying to make fun of everybody at the table, like ha, zing, 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 and then he left the table, and he said the next day, and he's talking these interviews, he said, I remember, Will, you came up to me, and you said, hey man, how do you think dinner went last night? And I was like, I think it went good, man, it was cool, it was great to be there, and he was like, actually, you really offended a lot of people. And you were just being a jerk. And when's the last time you let your dogs out of your apartment, man? And what's going on up there? And you need to get a hold of yourself. And then Bradley Cooper said, and that's when I realized I had a drug problem. He said, when he confronted me about the way I treated people, the way I lived my life, the decisions I was making, he said, no one ever confronted me because everyone was okay just watching me death spiral. And he says, but Will, you were the first person to confront me and come at me. And I admitted I had a problem and I got help and you saved my life. And he's crying and Will's crying. All these guys are crying, just talking about like, man, you loved me enough to be honest with me. The proto-reformer, Jan Hus, has a big statue in the middle of Prague and etched on the side of the statue, something Jan gave his life for. He said, love everyone and wish the truth for everyone. Because that's what love does, full of grace and truth. I love you enough to be honest with you. A good parent does that. A good coach does that. It's why we have family groups at this church. Community groups, we want you to know fellow believers in your community, grow more in your faith, and then we challenge you to get into family groups, 3-4 people. Why? So you can get with a group of people who loves you and will be honest with you. That you can confess your sins, but not be one of those accountability groups where we just get more comfortable talking about all our junk. And we're like, I struggle with this. And by struggle, I mean, give into it on a regular basis. And everyone goes, yay. And then no one changes. You're meant to be in a family group where you go, you know what? I can confess my sin and not feel shamed by you. And yet you can help me and challenge me and help me be the person I want to be. That's what Paul's team did. I'm going to love you right where you are, love you too much to let you stay there. I got compassion in an action orientation. That's how we're meant to live. How could he do that? How could he be that bold? How could he live like this? Well, he wasn't just wholehearted and he wasn't just level-headed. He also had a compelling vision. See, what we've covered so far is just basically clear eyes and full hearts can't lose. But what's the goal that got this team moving? Look in verse 11. And now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you, and may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all as we do for you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. He says, man, I want to make you better. I want us to be a tighter knit community, love each other better. I want us to live in holiness, have integrity, live in our values under the God who made us. I want us to keep improving as a community. Why? Because I want us to be like that at the day of the parousia of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the word he used for coming. It's twice in this passage, 6 times in the book. It's about to be a major feature that if you read the New Testament, it's almost 1 in every 3 verses is talking about the end of history. The New Testament leans forward. That this story is going someplace. History is a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in the end, Jesus Christ, who created it all, sustains it all, will end it all. And Paul has the end in mind. And as he clearly sees the end, hey, the gathering of accoutrements, the gathering of money, the gathering of titles, these things can be significant, but they are not a mission. They are a means, they are not an end. But the end is we're gonna meet the God who made us. And I want you ready for that moment. Paul doesn't just have a genuine affection. He doesn't just have an action orientation. He has a compelling vision. We are going to see the hero of our story. I've got compassion that's willing to correct you, and I got a compelling vision, passion, perspective, and a purpose that moves me. That's what you need, a bigger story than just my own. That word parousia is to live. Para means alongside. It was a technical term of the arrival of a dignitary in your city. That if the Caesar was rolling into town, you didn't just stay in your house and be like, oh, well, tell him I said hi. You would get the town ready. If the Caesar is coming, if the road that's all dirt got kind of messed up, if it got all windy, let's make the road straight. If it's got some potholes, let's fill them up. If it's got some bumps, let's make them smooth. Let's prepare the way for our leader. And then when he would come, the dignitaries of the city wouldn't just sit in their house. They would leave the city and stand by the road. They would come out to the king, and then as he came in, they would usher them in together. And when Paul looks at the end of history, he says it's going to be that way, that we are preparing like a bride for the wedding day, not to earn the marriage, but because we know the bridegroom's coming. And because he's coming, we want to be ready. And when he comes, we're coming out to him. And we're riding back with him at the coming of the Lord Jesus with his saints. History's going someplace. And where it's going, I want to be about the purposes of the king when he arrives. C.S. Lewis said it, the people who make the greatest impact on the world are those who have their eyes firmly set on the next one. That I believe history's going someplace. And I want my life now to reflect where this whole story is leading. And for Paul, the reason he could be that bold, the reason he could live like that is because his vision was of Jesus. He didn't just pick a cause. It was the best of all causes. And when he looked at Jesus Christ, he says, Jesus loved us. He loved us. That for God so loved the world, he sent his son. That's our message. That when God so loved us, he's like, how do I communicate that? How do you communicate love? What do I buy you some chocolates, buy some flowers, take you to a significantly marked up restaurant on the 14th? You know, these are just ideas people wrestle with. How do you communicate love? God says, I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna look around. What's the best I got? My son. There's no one better than him. And he's showing up. And Jesus did not reserve himself. He came wholehearted into our lives. He gave all of himself. I am here with you. And he did it knowing who we are. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. That's the Jesus who showed up. He knew what we were. And yet he'd sit with a woman devastated relationally and emotionally, and he would sit with her at the well and offer her life. Blind man says, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus says, bring him here. You got it. Leper said, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He says, I am willing. Be clean. But you see, he didn't hold himself away from us. He knew who you were. He knew what you did, and he did not reserve himself. Jesus Christ was wholehearted. I came for you. I love you. God so loved the world that I showed up in your world, and I didn't hold back from you. But John says he was full of grace and truth. I'm loving enough to tell you God loves you. And I'm honest to tell you, you are not okay. That you're beautiful in the image of God, but you're broken because of sin. And I'm not gonna hide that from you. And Jesus came real. He called a crowd of people children of the devil. That's harsh. He called your dad Satan. And they're like, what did he just say? Yeah, he said that. He was sitting around with a group of sinners one time, and the religious leadership said, why are you sitting around with those people? And he's like, doctors don't come for healthy people, they come for sick people. And you know, the people at the table were like, yeah, he comes for sick people like us. Wait, what? Jesus, what? And he's like, yeah, dude, you are a mess. Look at your life. Like Jesus was okay confronting you. You are loved and not okay. And you don't just need a little pick-me-up. You don't just need a little bit of encouragement. You just don't need a little bit of, you can do it. What you need is rescue. And you are so loved that I came for you. You are so broken because of sin, the Son of God must suffer. That's what Jesus said. We're so bad, he had to live the life we could not. And he had to die the death we deserved. And he did it. He did it. He said, I gotta come and be homeless, I'm homeless. I gotta come and only own the shirt on my back, I'll only own the shirt on my back. I gotta come and he who knew no sin be sin for you, then I will become that on the Father and say, on the cross and say, my Father, why have you forsaken me? If the wages of your sin is death, I'll take your death for you. Jesus held nothing back. I am wholehearted because I'm honest with you about your sin. And he did it, why? Because he knew I'm coming once for the forgiveness of sin. By my grace, you are saved. And then I'm coming again to take you home. So I will move all of history to rescue you because I love you enough to be honest with you. Compassion, conviction, because a compelling mission. History's going someplace, and what matters at the end is not the accumulation of stuff. It's fascinating. I read an interview once with I believe it was the director of the Godfather series. And he was a bit disappointed. He made some of the greatest movies of all time, The Godfather. And he said, but the point at the end, if you remember the last scene of Godfather 2, and the first two are the only ones that count. He said the ending scene was what? It's Michael Corleone sitting alone in that garden where they used to have a big party with their family. But to consolidate his power, to build his kingdom, what did he have to do? Murdered his brother, alienated his sister, murder all these different people to violate and crush all who opposed him, and he got everything he wanted. He got the money and he got the power, but what he didn't have was the relationships. And who cares about all that kingdom if you're alone? And he said it was meant to be a tragic tale. And so with some disappointment, he said, but it's wild how many people try to emulate him. They want to be the Godfather, and the whole point is to show you that pursuit is empty. But I remember when I was a kid, I've been thinking about him a lot lately. There was this couple that we would go to retreats at their house, the Toweries. It's called the Towery Ranch. And I thought it was like a retreat center. Turns out it was just their house, a ranch. And they would let church groups come out there and they wouldn't charge them. You could stay on their land, stay in their house. And I went as a kid. And then I remember I did that. And I remember when I was in high school, they made these movies about the end of the world. And they're supposed to terrify you, kind of scare you to Jesus. It was a big tactic in the 80s. I don't know if you know that. There's one of these, and I remember that they were, it was less scary, but it was a guy writing a letter about the fact that we're all gonna die, and he's writing to a family member, and he has this dream of heaven. And he dreamed people getting on an airplane to go to heaven, and the heavenly airport was Houston Intercontinental Airport. I remember that. It was international terminal. And he's writing this letter, and he's like, hey, Grandma and Grandpa were there. And the camera pans up, and I remember it was the Toweries. And they were standing at the top hey, and I was like, hey, I know them, the heavenly grandparents. I've been to their house. So then when I came to college and was a chaplain for that men's group, the guy said, hey, we do a retreat every year, and we do it out of this ranch outside of town, this Towery Ranch. I'm like, dude, I used to go there. We show up back at their house, and I remember as we showed up there, she walked me into this room, and literally floor to ceiling in this room were all these pictures of the different generations of young men from this group I was in that had come to her house for a retreat. And I realized dude, I never entered this room, but you've been ministering to not just high school kids and little kids, but college students for generations. And I'll never forget, on that retreat, she was pretty old by now, and Mr. Towery had passed. But Miss Towery took a group of us men and walked us into this room, and we stood around this big bed, and she said, this is where my husband was dying. I believe it was cancer. And she was like, towards the end, people were like, should we stop doing these retreats at your house? And he was like, absolutely not. And she said the thing he looked forward to more than anything was when these young men would come to his ranch. And even when he was in his bed, he would ask them to come and gather around the bed, and he would just challenge them to trust Jesus. He's worthy of your trust, to live lives of integrity. It's worth it. There's pain, but there's also great purpose. And he said, and he would have these young men hold hands and sing hymns to God together. And she said that was the last things he did with his life before he passed. And I remember she's telling us the story, and we're all in awe of this man, and we're just staring at an empty bed. And she had us grip hands, and we sang in that room. I remember we did this men's retreat, and at the end, we were cleaning up their houses. We were getting ready to leave, and she kept trying to help, but she was really old. We're like, we need to kind of get her away someplace where she can sit down. And so she grabbed my hand, and I remember I was walking her. We were going to head to some other room, and she just got too tired, so we had to sit down where we were, which was in the laundry room on top of an ice chest, which was not really what I had in mind for the sweet old lady. But we both just sort of plopped down in this ice chest and held hands. And as we did it, she just told me story after story after story of young women and young men whose lives had been changed in their home, on their ranch, for free, for generations. And I remember sitting there, and I'm like, we're in a laundry room on an ice chest, but you have a wake of blessing behind you, of lives like mine that you've touched. Which one's the win? At the end of days, who's going to stand there and have glory and have joy? Not the one who spent their life accumulating things that fade, but the person who said, yeah, I got a job and I made money and I had materials, but they were ends, they were means, they were not an end. The end was I leveraged my life for the greatest of all causes. And I joined a community that had some convictions, and we chased a cause that left a wake of blessing in our stead. What will be my glory and joy at the day of his coming? Is it not you? I got to tell you, one of the greatest joys of my life, and I think for many of you here could say the same, is being part of a church that says, you know what, we're going to love each other. Does that mean we'll rub up against each other in some tough ways sometimes? Absolutely. We're human beings. And yet, with compassion and conviction, we can chase a cause that can change us and change neighborhoods and change a city. And hey, change the world, because we are leveraging our life for what matters most. And I want you to do that with us.